Are you looking for continuing education from a Canadian provider?
Executive Links has almost 200 webinars to choose from on many topics including med-surg, critical care, geriatrics, peds, mental health, and more.
Each webinar is $35 and includes handouts, a certificate of completion, and the option to watch live and on demand for at least a year.
Save 15% for the rest of 2022 on any topic.
Just use code GRITTY at checkout.
Visit execulinks.net to register. That's execulinks.net.
Is this thing still on?
I think they can hear us a bit better now. Should we keep talking?
Of course. Let's say it louder for those in the back. Hi, and welcome to the Gritty Nurse Podcast, an unfiltered discussion about health and healthcare. My name is Amy Archibald-Varley.
And my name is Sarah Fung.
And we are your podcast hosts.
If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, or any other podcast platform, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can get updates on new episodes.
If you love our podcast and our advocacy work, please go to www.grittynurse.com and click on the Support Us button. This will give you access to exclusive episodes and early releases on a monthly basis.
This will help us with the cost of running the podcast, the time and energy to put out awesome and informative episodes. And for that, we thank you and we appreciate you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Gritty Nurse Podcast. And thank you for listening to us every week, coming in and tuning in. And this week we have a really special guest. I'm really excited to talk about her, to share her story, and really hope to shed some light on some of these conditions in terms of long COVID.
I'm so thankful for the guests that we have today. I think on the Gritty Nurse Podcast, we always talk about bringing different perspectives, amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced. And this person really is a warrior. That's what I want to call her, a warrior for what she's gone through and what she's done in terms of sharing her story. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tracy, and I will let her tell us a little bit about herself.
My name's Tracy, and previous to contracting COVID, I was working as a chef. A fun, pretty high energy, physically demanding, mentally demanding job. You know, we've all seen the TV shows, so lots of running around, lots of keeping things in your head. Oftentimes, when people find out I have long COVID, they'll say, "Whoa, what were your pre-existing conditions? Were you sick before? So all of the sort of typical things where people kind of try to minimize the possibility of this happening in their lives. Like, what can I do to distance myself from being in the crosshairs of this type of thing? So, I was definitely kind of like a work hard, long hours, lots of energy. I had a beautiful dog that was like a Great Dane Greyhound that we spent my time off running around. Pretty balanced, pretty decent, very active lifestyle. And I live alone.
Maybe you could even tell us a little bit about what it was like being a chef. Like, tell us a little bit about what that looked like, because I mean, we didn't even know that. That's super cool, right? That's like really awesome, and of course, yeah.
Yeah, I'm one of the very few people that started working in the restaurant industry sort of later in life. I didn't start working in restaurants until I was in my 30s. Previous to that, I was a children's book specialist, which is also an awesome job. I'm very lucky. I've had like two great jobs. I fell into it by accident. It's kind of a joke where I was talking to another chef friend of mine who was like, "Oh, my people are trying to tell me I'm an adrenaline junkie," and I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." And they're like, "No, I'm not," and I'm like, "How do you feel when the kitchen is slow?" And they're like, "I'm really, really bored." And I'm like, "And how do you feel when the kitchen gets slammed?" And they're like, "It's so great, it's energizing." I'm like, "Yeah, that's an adrenaline junkie." I'm not good at sitting down. I tried desk jobs a couple of times, and it made me feel, a little bit like I was like a dog at a window all day. Like, let me out of here. I got to do something. So, there's a lot of cooking it's a lot of fun. If you're really enjoying it, if you work at a good shop, there's the creative side of it, there's the math side of it, and then there's the physical side of it. And it's, for me, it was just fantastic. It was like this great, very satisfying match. I love food. I love to feed people. I want to give, it's like, oh, look at the weather. It was kind of a joke because usually sometime around the first week of February, I would always run like this like super green soup because I knew that nobody had been eating a vegetable like after the holidays. Nobody had like sat down with a vegetable for a really long
So
time.
true.
So I would like put it on the menu, and then I would hear people in the room being like, "Oh my god, this is exactly what I needed." I'm like, "That's right, you guys have not been eating your greens." So that was real. It was a lot of satisfaction. It really
Right,
satisfying
right, right.
to do.
It's funny that you bring up the adrenaline because I think a lot of nurses feel the exact same
Right.
way. Like, especially if you work in labor and delivery like Amy and I did, or you work in Emerge, the unpredictability and just not knowing what you're going to get is actually what we live for. And I know a lot of nurses have trouble also transitioning to office type jobs because it's just so different than what we're used to. It's a different kind of stress, like deadlines. It's like, oh my God, I got to type on this keyboard, not I have to save somebody or I have to perform CPR. So I know it's different than cooking, but in the sense it's like the personalities that get drawn to those types of jobs.
Cooking is I mean, it's like it is high stress, but lives are not at stake. So you guys are amazing.
Well, I mean, there's fires sometimes in the kitchen. I don't know. I've watched too
Yeah,
much of Kitchen Nightmares.
Oh
it's
no,
true.
kitchen nightmares. Yeah, but it's very interesting because I think one of the things that we've read about you and kind of learned was, with what you've been saying with, having that type of a job, it being very fast paced, being very busy, and there's a lot of complexity in your work. It's almost heartbreaking to hear, like, I don't want to give your story away, you're going to tell your story, but it's almost heartbreaking to hear the change in what has happened in your life since you actually had COVID. So Tracy, would you mind telling us, when did you contract COVID, and how did you get COVID?
I didn't believe it when it happened. It's still kind of shocking to me. I was finishing up work.
Mhm.
I'd closed down my kitchen, so it's nighttime, and I was on my way home, and I saw a person. I live in Parkdale, so it's generally, well,
Hmm.
there's a lot of there's people around all the time. There's always people on the street. There's all kinds of people on the street. So I was on Queen Street, lots of traffic, and I saw this person, and I thought late enough at night they may have had a couple of drinks. I'm not sure. So I was walking by them, and I'm not a nervous person, and I'm used to my neighborhood. So I gave them a big smile and was like sort of looking at them to make sure that they were okay, and they
Hmm.
made eye contact with me, and then they grabbed me. And so this was the second week of March, basically, just the first week of March. Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. The first week of March, the end of the first week of March, and they grabbed me, and I went to pull back, and they, they grabbed me by my shirt collar, and then they coughed in my face, and then they ran their hands all over me, and shook me as I was trying to get away. And they kept coughing, and then they laughed and they said, "You're sick now. You're sick now." And I was like, "Well, Then they let go of me, and I kind of scooted off. It was scary, but it wasn't like they didn't punch me or, they just kind of shook me around a little bit. And I thought, this is someone who thinks it's funny. They just wanted to be aggressive. They see this, lone woman walking down the street, and they think it's their time to be like hilarious by being, frightening. Like, it was obviously meant to frighten me. That was my take. I was like, it was like not like being catcalled, but like similar to that sort of like engagement where there was like, okay, I have a chance to make this person, this woman walking alone, feel very uncomfortable. And they did their job. And so I kind of brushed it off. I went home and I washed my face and mouthwash, and I was like, okay. And I got in touch with a friend, and I was like, I can't believe what happened to me. And I went and sort of laughed about it. I was nervous. I was really shook up, but then I didn't think much more of it. I thought it was like just a weird sort of Parkdale incident. Maybe the person had been drinking. Maybe they had some mental health issues. Because some people said to me, "Oh, did you call the police?" And I'm like, oh. Like, this person wasn't a clear and present danger to anybody. There was no real, what I perceived as a real threat at that moment. And then a few days later, I got my first symptom, and I had taken a few days off from work because it was my birthday week. So I had already had the weekend off as part of my regular schedule, so I took an extra day off. So basically, I'd gone home. I wasn't really in contact with anybody. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't go to any parties. I was supposed to meet friends for my birthday on the weekend, and I had a bit of a sore throat. And I said, I don't know if I want to risk it because at this point, all we're hearing is like the virus is coming 2 days before what ended up being lockdown at the time. So it was very, very present danger where I had been like sanitizing everything and wearing gloves and like walking around and, cleaning surfaces nonstop, and doing everything that I thought was the right thing to do to stay safe. And yeah, so when my symptoms started, they were pretty mild, but I thought, oh, let's just be on the safe side. And I didn't go and meet up with my friends for my birthday. And I have been sick ever since.
Wow, I'm so sorry, first of all, Tracy, to hear that story. It sounds, I mean, you were traumatized. I feel like this was a traumatic event, and it's just really, really unfortunate that this has happened to you and that, I don't know who this person was, but I'm assuming you never saw them again. So there's no closure to that. But their actions have been really ongoing for a long time. So I'm sorry to hear that.
Obviously, there was malice in this, but I don't think that the person thought that it would ever lead to something like this. I mean, obviously,
Hmm.
people were dying, so that I maybe should take that back. But I don't know. I have no idea what they expected the outcome to be. I don't know. I don't have any. That's not something I think about very much. Like I talk about it because for a long time I didn't talk about it not because it was disturbing to me, but because it seemed. I wasn't until I realized that people were kind of like, "Oh my goodness!" I'm like, "Oh yeah, that is actually quite disturbing." I was like, "Oh yeah, I should probably let
Yeah.
people know this." It's not something I dwell on. I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like I don't think about
Hmm.
this person. I hope that they are genuinely hope that they are okay. I don't really have a vengeful spirit. I hope they didn't do it to anybody else. A one-off. I don't know what they were thinking.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, thank you for sharing that with us and with our listeners, Tracy. I think first thing I want to say to you is like I'm really sorry that that happened. I don't really have any other words than that should have never happened to you. That's unacceptable. That's also, I think this is another topic that we talk about a lot on our podcast where we talk about, violence towards women. And although you didn't take that on as, that particular or, and that you don't have malice, that still is violence towards women, right? Like, I mean, the fact that you were targeted, that the fact that there's probably other underlying things, but at the end of the day, this individual, whomever this was, decided to choose you, not a male, you as a woman,
Yes,
and do this to you, right? I think yeah, that's something that has to be called out.
that they perceived as vulnerable and that was without protections. And so
Yeah,
that I'm sure I can say that that was. It wasn't like there was nobody else on the street. It was like.
right. Yeah, no,
Uh,
I'm incredibly sorry that that happened to you, and it's definitely not right at all.
Yeah, so maybe so what happened then between the time where you start to get the sore throat and the symptoms to where, I mean, maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about what happened after that. Like, did you have to go to the hospital?
So
Yeah.
my after my it started with the sore throat, of course. So that's like the first big clue, and then and I'm hearing about this a lot now with the latest sort of variants coming on. My initial symptoms were primarily gastrointestinal. I didn't have like I wasn't congested. I didn't have a lot of like the early sort of signifiers that we were supposed to look for, but I knew that I wasn't okay. So
Mhm.
I hung back. I stayed tight. I stayed in my house. I didn't have any contact with anybody. And then I just kept getting weaker. I was having like rolling fevers, not consistent fevers, but like peaks and valleys of fevers all throughout the day. I'm pretty sure I was somewhat delusional at points. And so I reached out to telehealth. So it was like, how do I proceed? Because we were hearing our hospitals are going to we can't overrun our hospitals. Our healthcare, providers need to, be not overwhelmed. We need to make sure that we take care of them first, all the testing, all that stuff. So I called telehealth and I was like, well, what do I do? These are the symptoms that I'm having. I hadn't left the country. I hadn't been in contact with a confirmed case. So the advice was unless you're in extreme distress, stay home, write it out. You'll be fine in a couple of. That's what I tried to do.
And when did you start to realize that this was more than just, because I know that some people, they have COVID, in a couple weeks they recovered, as you mentioned that you got the advice from telehealth. When
Hmm.
did you realize that this was something more, that you were starting to have some long-term mental or physical side effects?
Not only was I not getting better, I was getting, I was getting worse, right? But not in a way that was like that sort of acute. Oh my goodness, you got to go to the hospital. I was having difficulty breathing, but not extreme difficulty breathing, right? So it was belabored breathing. There was, again, rolling fevers, headache, not feeling myself, the sore throat, the gastrointestinal issues. And so they weren't improving. So I think I reached out to telehealth one more time without any, basically got told the same thing. Like, it's like, oh, you just one of the unlucky people. Like, you're not in crisis. You'll be fine. And then I was eating some chicken soup. And from one mouthful, I was like, oh, delicious chicken soup. And then the next mouthful, nothing. No taste, no smell. Like a light switch went off. And so that's when I was like, this is terrifying. Because it was obvious to me when people were like, oh, you lose your sense of taste and smell. And it's like, well, you're congested. Of course you lose your sense of taste and smell. But this was like absolute and instantaneous. And I was like, oh, this is my brain. Like something neurological has just snapped. These sensations, both of these senses have just disappeared. And I think that was my first real sort of like the creeping fear. Like, why is this happening so far from my initial symptoms? Like, it had been a few weeks.
Wow.
And again, it was profound. So at that point, I decided, as telehealth said, we're at that point early on, they weren't testing people, saving the tests. I was like, oh, I'm just going to try this anyway. So I went to, I thought I'm just going to risk it and someone can tell me something. So I went to Emerge at Mount Sinai, and it was suggested to be that it might be menopause. That was my
Wow.
problem. That was a
Oh my
little
gosh.
distressing. And I was like, okay, well, no. That's,
Jeez.
if that's the case, people need to get a lot more time off for that. But
Right.
no, this is not a functioning person right now. It was extremely difficult to try and get any kind of validation for what was going on and to figure out why my condition sort of continued to deteriorate, because I was just getting weaker, less capable. There would be like a couple of hours where I would be like, oh, maybe this is over. Like, I was like, this is going to end any second. Long COVID didn't exist in my mind. I didn't know, there was no idea of that, which is why it's always interesting to me when people say, oh, it's just psychological. It's like, it didn't have a name. It didn't exist.
Right.
There wasn't
Mhm.
anything for me to latch onto. Like, I believed that I would be better at any minute. Any minute I was going to wake up and feel relieved and then get back to work, and it was going to be great. Which, I mean, honestly, I might have delayed my response in seeking care, because I just was like, obviously, if it doesn't, either you're over it in 2 weeks or you end up in the hospital. Neither of those things have happened. So I'm somewhere in the middle, but I'm
Right.
not in crisis. So I just was doing the thing and waiting it out, and eating well and taking my vitamin C and hoping for the best. And it got worse. I developed some pretty serious, that's not anaphylactic, but some pretty extensive food allergies, where I started reacting to things.
Oh,
I was reacting to whatever the filler was in my vitamin C supplements, like any kind of, like, I had to stop taking vitamins because I would have allergic reactions to things. I have about 5 different kinds of rashes that I have photographs of,
oh my
Oh
and
goodness.
my.
breathing issues, fevers. Every time I ate, I would be ill. So it was like, this is not getting better. This is getting worse and worse and worse. My energy levels were bad, and I was like, okay, I'm falling to pieces. And that's when it's when I went online, and I'm like, okay, where are y'all at? I can't be alone.
Right.
And trying to find people, trying to find any kind of mention of this. And so at that point, people across the globe, groups are springing up and being like, okay, this is a thing. I'm not getting better. I'm not getting better. I'm not getting better. And you see popping up all over the place. So it wasn't a great feeling, but it was good to know that, nothing happens to just one person, healthcare, like health
Right.
wise, right? Like, it's just, there's nobody who's like the singularity. But it was still very frustrating trying to get any kind of healthcare, because of this didn't exist. B, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Hospitals are overrun. Doctors, like, everybody has been stretched. Nobody knows exactly what's going on. It's a brand
Yeah.
new condition. So it took me, and foolish me, because I'm like, I'm a chef, and I don't know if you know anything about restaurant culture, but self care is not one of our greatest attributes.
Oh, yeah,
All about
similarities
self-care.
all around.
We're
So
horrible at
we're
self-care,
just
yep.
like, yeah, I'm gonna push through this. It's gonna be great, right? So that kind of attitude. So like, and so I didn't have a family doctor because I was like, well, if I'm never sick, I'm great, it could be fine.
Right,
I just didn't occur to me. It's like, you cut your hand, get out some saran wrap and get on with your day. So
right.
I was in a poor position personally because I just didn't have anybody who had knew my medical history, who could look at me and go like, hey, this isn't like you. So that was unfortunate for me personally. As things moved along, the summer went by. I read some notes in a notebook that I had made because I was trying to track my symptoms. And I read some notes in this notebook that I'm keeping, and it was predominantly gibberish. I was kind of out of my mind. I was not holding up well. And then in August, that's when my cardiac issue started. So that's when things
Wow.
became a little more urgent, where I was having arrhythmias and tachycardias. So like picking up a glass of water, my heart rate would just go through the roof. And I had
Wow.
an extended, like it was about 36 hours of a really elevated heart rate and arrhythmias. And I was like, I called telehealth, and I was like, this is what's going on. And when I described what was happening to me, they're like, yeah, we're sending an ambulance. So I'm like, what? Like I still had this sort of like
Oh,
disbelief.
no.
I was like, you're sending an ambulance? And I'm like, okay. So, I was like, okay, I went down and I walked down and met the ambulance, and they put me in the ambulance and took, my vitals and whatever, and then closed the back door. And again, still in this ridiculous state, I was like, what's going on? They're like, we're taking you to the
Where
hospital.
are
I'm like,
you
oh, you're
taking
actually,
me?
yeah, like, I thought that they were going to be like,
Oh,
you need to
no.
relax, go home and have a cup of tea. Like I was still expecting not just not to be taken seriously, but I don't think that I was understanding. I think that I was too unwell to know how unwell I was.
Right, you didn't
Mhm, makes
understand the
sense.
severity of your illness,
Yeah, because
yeah.
I've been sort of in this sort of fevered dream state for months on end, and I didn't realize how bad things had gotten. And they were like, "Yeah, this isn't good." That's when what kind of my journey towards seeking care, the little that there is available, sort of began in earnest. And they were like, you need a family doctor. I got referred to the acute ambulatory care at Women's Hospital, and so went in there and sort of started a battery of of testing and trying to figure out exactly what is going on with me. So
Yeah, so, like, based on all of what you've said to like, where are you today? So, you kinda went through this journey where you weren't too sure what was happening,
yeah,
found out through all of the like, you start having these various different types of symptoms, and now you're at the place where you're actually hospitalized. So when did the words like post COVID-19 syndrome or long COVID come out? Like when did those that diagnosis come to fruition?
honestly, for me, like obviously, I had been online and looking for people and looking in support groups. For me, it was relatively early on. I was like, okay, this is not normal. There's an extended period of like illness that's happening to me. So for me, it was fairly early. I would say, by the end of April, May, I knew something was wrong. Again, I'm not recognizing how wrong, but something was definitely
Mhm,
wrong. And then, as far as once I started going into the AACU at Women's College, I think that's when so probably August, September of 2020 was
mhm.
when it was like, okay, this is a kind of a thing that we're looking at as far as naming is a post-COVID, long haul, all the things that have been bandied about. So I guess yeah, probably September of 2020 was like sort of an official doctor stamp on it where those words were used.
And, did you accept early on that you had long COVID, or were you still not quite sure for a
No,
while?
no, I had definitely accepted that I had long COVID. I just hadn't accepted the severity of the consequences. I knew that I wasn't well. I knew I wasn't well. I moved as though I wasn't well. I did things to sort of, stay resting and stay hydrated, and, and was keeping up in long COVID groups online to see what I could do to sort of improve my situation. I just didn't realize like, never occurred to me that I would be in this position 25 months later, not at all. This was
Yeah.
extended. I was like, it's kind of like laughing now. I'm looking at notes from like, it's been 9 weeks. And I'm like, oh, haha, you're so naive. And,
Jeez.
yeah, I didn't realize the length of time that this, might take. And I didn't realize, yeah, I just didn't, I knew I was sick. I just didn't realize how sick I was.
Sick you were.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh my
that was
goodness.
the denial part.
Yeah, we were all kind of thinking the same thing about COVID in general, but I'm just wondering, like you talked a lot about your physical symptoms. Have you had any sort of mental symptoms out of COVID?
I'm gonna sort of divide them up. It's like the sort of the cognitive and then the emotional. And so both, absolutely. Emotionally, and I definitely seen this happen now that I've sort of been living in this world a little bit longer and meeting new people that have, they're like, I think I might have long COVID. And level of extreme depression and extreme anxiety that takes hold of people and that I went through. I mean, it was I've never experienced anything like it. It was, again, this was early on, but like definite like suicidal ideations, and then just like hand tremoring anxiety, like just sitting and vibrating and being like, I don't even know how I can exist like this. Just a level of physical fear that and I've dealt with anxiety before. We've all gone through ups and downs. This was unbelievable. Didn't know that I could survive with that amount of like stress. It was all encompassing, and it is something that is still definitely comes in waves. And I would say that for the extended group of people that I know that are going through this, that you're sort of, this is not a good time. It's unpleasant, it's boring, it's scary, and you're sick. And so yeah, of course you're going to feel bad, and then every now and then this wave will crash into you where it's everything is bleak, where everything is
Wow.
pointless. And so, and then, definitely in the early stages with newer people, because I belong to a Zoom group that kind of runs these people just like a drop-in room. So people will come in, and when they come in for the first time, and they haven't talked to anybody, or nobody understands what they're going through, and they just sort of unload like a dump of information. We're all kind of, and we have to kind of stop them and be like, we know that you're feeling this anxious and this depressed, and that is part of the cycle of this illness. So let's just let you know that those things are true. And yes, it's totally reasonable for you to feel bad because this is a terrible thing. But this is also, it kind of hijacks you. It hijacks your like
Yeah.
emotional state.
Wow.
It hijacks your, I can't think of the word. Sorry, I lose words sometimes, but it's like, it's completely different than anything I've ever experienced. And I've seen so many people go through it. And then, mentally, not as sharp. I can't read books anymore. I can't really read anything past a couple of paragraphs without it becoming either physically painful, or I just can't remember. I can't retain information the same way. I mentioned I used to work in kids' books. Reading was what I did for, part of my job. I don't know if you can remember the old Twilight Zone about a guy who was very excited about the end of the world coming, and he just wanted to sit and read books in a library, and then he steps on his glasses. It's kind of like being that person. It's like, oh, you
Oh
just had to
man.
spend all of these months in bed, and you're thinking, I'm going to catch up on my reading. And it's like, no, you're not. You can't. You're physically not capable. The information doesn't stay in your brain. And there's a lot of comparisons being drawn between like the effects of COVID on the brain and a traumatic brain injury, where things like seeing and
Wow.
hearing are suddenly become taxing experiences. I've gone through
Wow.
extreme sound sensitivity, light sensitivity, the phantom smells. That was just a horrific episode that lasted a few months. Yeah, so like a lot of people experience smelling cigarette smoke. I was convinced that there was dog feces. Like as I said, I had a dog. She's now living with other people because I cannot physically take care of her right now. So I was like, oh, it smells like the dog has had an accident. So I spent days like crawling around my apartment. And the worst one, strangely enough, was, and it lasted for such a long time, was the smell of pine sol, which is something I'd
Oh,
Oh
never
my
had in my
god.
house. I like never used it in my house. I don't have it in my
Wow.
house. And it was that acrid, acidic, it's like big smell if you ever smelled it. And it was just relentless. And that's again, that's not being congested. There's like a wiring is offline. Yeah, lots of emotional, lots of cognitive, lots of neural, skin, like pretty much anything that you could think of, whatever it is that COVID does, because we don't understand the mechanism yet, it is very opportunistic. It's going to find whatever nook and cranny. If there's a weakness, it's going to exploit it. If you have a propensity towards something, it's going to blow it up.
Absolutely horrible, like horrifying. There are other people that are experiencing this as well. Like you mentioned that there are support groups, and thankfully that there are people that are around talking about it. And I have to be honest, like I didn't actually hear very much about long COVID. Like I think a lot of the attention has been focused on people who get the diagnosis, have COVID, what happens with their, acute stay in the ICU, and then that's it. But there's not a lot of conversation about the debilitating after effects of, the post COVID-19 syndrome or long COVID. And I'm glad that you're here to shed a light on that. And, one of the things that I kind of wanted to ask you about, going through this entire process, hearing about your symptoms, hearing about how it's affected you, what are some of the supports you have received? So you mentioned that you were able to go to a group. What are some of the supports that you haven't received? So tell us a little bit about what your experience has been in terms of, the support you have or have not received in terms of this diagnosis.
It has become a very isolating experience. Initially, again, most of the conversation is around acute COVID, and that makes sense. People are in crisis. People are, out there trying to save lives and minimize the damage. I think it's very difficult for people to, understand what this means. When people talk about long COVID, you hear people say things like fatigue and brain fog, and it all sounds very sort of melancholy, like I'm going to be in some Edwardian daybed, while somebody brings me clear broth and I'm slightly under the
Right.
weather. Not something that is, profoundly disabling. So I think that the way that it's been reported hasn't given people a complete picture of how dangerous it can be. And I feel like, so I'm talking to you, and I feel like our relationship with sort of chronic illness in general, like at large, and disability, and invisible disabilities or dynamic disabilities, where it's like, so this is going to be my whole day. I spent all the day lying in bed, making sure I had some broth, and I prepared for expending this energy for tonight. So it looks like I'm great, right? But we can't live our lives like 2 out of 24 hours a day and call ourselves functioning people. So I just want everybody to know that,
Right.
even though I'm sitting here talking and having a grand old time, this is it. This is my whole day. This is the day.
Wow.
Right? It's like stay hydrated, make sure you've got some nourishment, do this, and then lie down. So I don't want to give anybody sort of a false impression of whatever. And I just want to say too, I'm about the middle of. I consider myself to be middle of the pack as far as this goes. There are people who are in better shape than I am, who are more ambulatory, who can sort of work from home part time or can work part time. And then, I have other people that I know that are, were too weak to digest their own food, who are on nasogastric feeders, that their bodies
Hmm.
just cannot produce enough energy to get energy. And
Wow.
there's people who can only talk when they are lying down because they don't have the energy to stand up. They don't have the brain power or however it works to stand up and speak at the same time. So they can talk when they're lying down or they can stand up, but they can't do both. There are people who've been hospitalized for almost a year. And so you sort of get into like another thing people don't know much about is like sort of post-viral illness territory where we're talking about people with like ME and other sort of, disabling illnesses. I think I've lost track of where.
No, I mean, everything what you're saying is actually important. I think this whole conversation is eye-opening, at least for me. I'm sure it is for Sarah as well. And I think we were just kind of, what more support do you think we should have? Like, I think this conversation is hugely important, and I really hope that we can blow this up and get a lot more attention to this, because I don't think there's enough attention paid to what's happening with people who are having this, like yourself, Tracy, who's experiencing this. And it sounds really, really scary. And I think one of the things that I want people to know is we keep hearing people say things like, oh, it's just a cold, COVID's just a cold, it's not that serious. It sounds, if you don't mind me swearing, it sounds pretty fucking serious.
It's pretty
Like, it sounds,
fucking serious.
yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds pretty fucking serious. And I think that, the fact that, some people are like, oh, you have a 99% chance of living. Okay, well, you may live and you may survive having COVID-19, but hearing what your experience doesn't sound great. It sounds really fucking awful. And I
It's
think this is where we're trying to push people to have these conversations.
it is grim, and I can't remember this. Someone on Twitter, Fan McGelly. I don't know how to pronounce Fang. I can't. You, I can't remember. I have no. I've
It's all
never
good.
said the words out loud. But one of the things that they said was, "Yeah, you'll probably live, but do you know how sick you can get before you die?" There's a lot of things between.
Wow, yeah.
It's like there's a big gap between dying and all of the rest of the things that can happen to you. I think that people confuse like this long COVID, this prolonged illness, this with. I like to disambiguate. I like to make a difference between post COVID and long COVID. So if you get acute COVID and you're hospitalized and it trashes your lungs and sort of the things we've come to expect from an acute COVID infection, you will be sick for a while afterwards. You will need help getting back to your baseline. You might need rehab. There's a lot of physical things that you might need trouble with. And we're at this point, people are working really hard to make sure that those supports are in place. We're seeing one of the difficulties is that there's a split. There are people like me that got mild COVID, that weren't hospitalized, that didn't have an acute episode the way that we think about it, who has ended up being more ill for a longer period of time than if I was in the first category. And when I see the majority of the COVID clinics that are opening up here in Canada and across the States and Britain, because I keep an eye on all these things, the majority of them are for people in the first category. So it says, oh, we deal with long COVID, and what they're actually dealing with is post COVID. And long COVID is separate and needs to be investigated and treated separately than post COVID does. Post COVID is like, you had COVID, it did some terrible things to your body, you're in very rough shape. Here's how we're going to help you get back to your baseline. And long COVID is something that continues to happen to.
Right, right. That's a really important distinction.
So, like I said, I didn't have cardiac symptoms until I was 5.5 months in. My
Mhm.
sound sensitivity issues didn't start until probably 18 months in. So whatever this is, or whatever the mechanism is, like, and I'm not saying, because some people are like, it's a post, you've got like a viral reservoir, or it's ME, which, it might be at this point, but it's a separate category, and there is no, again, it's not like a thing happened and then we have to deal with the damage. And this is people in my category are definitely, whatever it is, it's still happening to me. So it's really very frustrating. People say, like, they recommend things like, oh, you graded, like, you've got to get out and go for a walk, which will absolutely. The last time I went for a long walk, which was sometime in 2020, I couldn't get up for about 6 weeks. I do. Obviously, you don't, if you can avoid being, lying in bed all day, that's always a good thing, to walk around the house or go for a 5-minute walk. Like, I'm aware of those things, and I stay as active, that's the wrong word, but, I do everything I can to sort of minimize the effects of being primarily bed and housebound. But this is not done. I don't always know if a new symptom is going to suddenly appear. Like I said, with the sound sensitivity, which is now mostly gone, or with the light sensitivity, which is now mostly gone, or will I be able to, I can maybe read a couple of things, like a couple of, a few paragraphs or a magazine article one day, and then, a couple of hours later, my vision is blurry. So it's the aftercare, all of the supports are being thrown into this one basket, and the basket that I'm in is sort of empty. Again, people, it's not a recognized disability. It's not, and I think it's hard for people to understand exactly. There's nothing anybody could say that was good to describe this to me that would make me understand what this feels like. The battery reference is good, like an uncharged battery, but it is difficult to think like, oh, I feel pretty good today, so I took a bath, and then
Mhm.
that bath made me sick, or, the bath gave me a fever, or it made me nauseous, or it made me not able to
Wow.
pick up a glass of water. Like, I went from quite literally shouldering 50-pound bags of potatoes and running up the stairs with them to not being able to hold my phone. And people are like, oh, you're just deconditioned. I'm like, that is not what
No.
is happening here. at all.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot in the way of support outside of like these little sort of, grassroots sort of ad hoc support groups, which are a little bit Wild Westy. I've talked about it before. I don't have anything. I mean, obviously you find things in common with people, but there's people from different socioeconomic groups, people, different racial groups, gender identities. And the thing we have in
Hmm.
common is that we're all very, very sick. It makes for a precarious safety net. Because there's people who come in and, that are sort of like, oh, the Chinese did this to us. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. So there's a lot of like bad politics and there's nobody in
Wow.
charge. Like these things aren't,
Right,
they're
Wow.
right.
not monitored. There isn't like somebody that's sitting over here and being like, okay, this is going to be safe. This is like a safe place for
Right.
you to
Wow.
be, so you don't know who you're going to run into when, and you're trying to be open-hearted and kind because people are unwell. And I'm, in the sort of like what we call the first wave of people that got long COVID. So we're kind of like the elders of the
Right.
community, where you're trying to be welcoming and guide people through it, and you just never know what's going to come out of somebody's mouth. So it's a
Jeez.
really strange place to be. It's like, how do I negotiate somebody being like what I think of as horrific, or racist, or cruel, or whatever? How do I negotiate like my sort of strong desire to be like, you can't be here with like, you're going through a crisis, that we are the only people that understand it, right? And try to manage that, what I think of as a duty of care to people, when it doesn't get reciprocated, obviously, when they're just, spouting off some nonsense, right? It could be a strange environment to be in. So sometimes
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Jeez.
it's more like work than comfort.
Wow.
So you have to be very careful negotiating those spaces, especially as like a racialized woman. Not always.
It's a whole, yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez. I
Wow, it
couldn't even
sounds like you've
imagine what the dynamics for that would be. Like, I mean,
it's it's pretty
it sounds like it would
intense.
be very challenging. Yeah, I was gonna say. And I think this is actually a good point to say that, the budget is gonna be coming out this week. And, Sarah and I might have a little bit of an opportunity to, after the budget has been released, to actually say something on the news about like what our thoughts might be. And I think maybe this might be an opportunity for us, Sarah, to throw out the idea about more support for long COVID and for people who are experiencing this. And honestly, I think one of the other main things that we have to talk about is just disability and the
Yeah.
invisibility aspect. Like, I think we've seen challenges in related to the ODSP and how that's not livable in terms of, we're seeing inflation, the high in terms of like the highest inflation we've seen in years. And we have people that are living off of less than $2,000 a month. So I mean, I think there's a lot of work and a lot of things that we should push in terms of
They're living on almost half of
yeah, that's
it's
horror. That's
yeah, it's $1,170 a month. And it's like, I don't know
Oh
where
my gosh, that is crazy.
it's $1,169 a month to pay your rent, feed yourself, and it's sort of like, have your phone, and people are like, phone. And I'm like, yeah, we live in a world where people need phones. Like, it's not
That is
reasonable
a
for somebody.
yeah.
necessity, yeah.
Yeah.
I think having internet is a necessity, like, you gotta decide between these things.
And you can't, how do you reach your healthcare providers? How do you go, how do you get to appointments? People are rationing their meds. People are rationing, they're going without food. I'm sure if you're on Twitter, you see it all the time.
Yep.
And now with the expansion of MAID, it is a very frightening landscape. I was, a lot of the people in the sort of the main support group where I where the Zoom groups are there's people all over the place. There's like India, Sweden, Australia, but there's a good chunk of people in Canada, a good chunk of people in the States, so it's the majority. I was trying to explain to people in the States about the state of disability supports here and made, and because obviously people in that group, some people are applying for disability, and they're sort of like, oh yeah, it's going to be like a 6-month wait for geared to income housing. And it's like, 6 months, it's 10 years here.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in for anybody that doesn't know, MAID stands for Medical Assistance in Dying, for our US listeners that, don't know that term.
There's so much work that needs to be done.
In the States, they think of just Canada, we've got socialized medicine, we've got all this, and they just assumed that I was great, that everything was being taken care of. Like, they literally got to a point where they were sort of like, can you send us some articles, because they just couldn't
They didn't believe you.
believe. They didn't believe me. They do now, but it was really frustrating. I'm like, no, this is what is happening here. here's what's going on where I live. Because like, well, why don't you just do this and why don't you just do that? And I'm like, those things aren't available to me. There is no rent geared to
Wow.
income,
Yeah.
like 30% of your income here. There's nothing. And
Yeah. No
so
401ks here.
yeah, so it's just it was, and it was shocking to me too, because when I was, we hear about the American healthcare system, and I'm not going to speak on that, but just sort of the not ease, because it's not easy, but certainly easier than here that it was for people to access financial support and housing support in the States than it is in what these people think of as pinko Canada. It's like that's
Right.
madness to me.
No, that's
um
for sure.
it
Yeah.
was it's appalling. And I spent some time today with they had the I don't know if you've seen the disability filibuster thing that's happening around, like trying to stop the expansion of MAID, to stop it including mental health issues, which is mind-boggling. And
Yeah.
then after that, mature minors, I don't even know how it's on the table.
I think the conversation on Made for Sure that is a whole podcast episode in itself. But I mean, I think just bringing light and talking about, what is happening in relation to disability, what's happening in relation to long COVID. These are huge conversations that we need to have, and we need to bring them to the political forefront, especially that, we're coming up to an Ontario budget, and there's election time coming. Like, there's a lot of things that we need to talk about, bringing out into the open, to make sure that we're putting out the things in healthcare that we need, and we're having those supports put in place. But one of the things that I want to ask you, just before you go, because we don't want to keep you too long, is if there's one thing that you would want people to know, or a takeaway, what would you want them to know?
I want people to do everything they can to protect themselves and each other. To just do a real a risk assessment that includes the possibility of disability, of long-term, life-changing disability. Because I know the majority of
Mhm.
people will survive. I know the majority of people, get COVID and not end up in the hospital, especially with, vaccines are very helpful for that. I know that people's risk assessment is flawed because they just do not think that this is a possibility, that they go from being an active, go get 'em kind of person to being bedridden for 25 months and counting.
Mhm.
That they could
Yeah.
be one of those and those numbers are going up all the time. I meet people every day that are unaware of the real possibility of this. And again, I'm middle of the pack. You might not end up where I am. You could be better off than where I am, or worse. I want people to be careful, and I want them to think about each other.
That's so great, Tracy. I think I've learned so much talking to you. You gave so many specific examples of how long COVID has affected you. And you mentioned that you had spent all day preparing for this talk. Thank you so much for dedicating your time and limited energy towards us. We really appreciate it. And I think there's so much more we could talk about. But one thing I did want to mention is that you have a GoFundMe account, and we would really like to amplify that. So maybe if you could tell our listeners about your GoFundMe account and how they can find you on Twitter.
So Twitter, my Twitter handle is at Hazy. I've forgotten my Twitter handle. Is at Hazy Thompson.
Hold on, I
It's,
think I might have it up. Hold on.
Now we're madly looking it up.
I can't remember if there's an
It's
underscore.
you're right. It's at Hazy Thompson. You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Go ahead
So
and say it again.
it's Hazy Thompson. It's HAZIE Thompson, THOMPSON on Twitter. My GoFundMe is pinned to my profile. I am trying to access some alternative care. After a couple of years of this, you'll try a lot of things. Not everything, but a few things that you wouldn't normally. So I would like to be out of bed. So yeah, thank you for that. There's a little bit about my story on the GoFundMe. If my DMs are open for anybody who has any questions, if they feel like, they would like to know something about long COVID, or if they have any concerns about their own health or the health of someone they know, I am happy to help direct them anything I think might be useful, or answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for coming on today. We
Or
really appreciate it. And
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Tracy.
yeah,
I
this
thank
was
you.
amazing.
This
Yeah,
is, yeah, thank
and
you.
we definitely are going to amplify your GoFundMe, and Thank you for sharing that with us and sharing this story and coming on to the Greeners podcast to talk about your experience and with long COVID. And we wish you the best. We're rooting for you, and we're going to continue to amplify and support you in any way that we can.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'm so glad that you're bringing this to a new audience and letting people know. I can't thank you enough. You guys are very excited. Sorry. All right.
Thank you so much.